now. So it's David Reed with The Full Armor with David Reed, and this is episode number 2. And I have a special guest today, which is the man who produces videos and goes by the name of Pro-Life Andrew. And so since this is episode 2 and the first guest that I've had, Andrew, you are my first guest on The Full Armor with David Reed. And yes, that is a reference to put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the wiles of the devil, because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world and spiritual wickedness in high places. So that's where we came up with the name. So first, just to tell me a little bit, you and I have never met before, so I don't know you.
This is our first time.
Exactly, but I have seen several of your videos. They're very effective. They're very well produced. And you have, an issue, abortion, and that's been your issue. So just tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, your history. When did you become an Adventist? When did you decide to sort of jump with all 4 feet into this abortion thing?
Sure. So, the summary version is that I grew up in a relatively secular home. I never read the Bible at all. We were not religious people. We never read the Bible. I can't remember for the first 16 years of my life reading the Bible in our home, even one time. And then I started getting into a lot of trouble. I was kicked out of school. At the age of 16 years old, I was arrested by the police. This is in Washington State, and initially charged with 7 kidnappings and armed robberies. We later pled guilty to, I think the final disposition was like 3 or 4 armed robberies and burglaries with gun enhancements, and sentenced to prison, adult prison, from 1995 until 2008. And because I was so young, even though I was tried as an adult, when I was sent to the adult prison, I was put in solitary confinement for the first 2 years, which happened to be a fantastic blessing, because that's where I began to read the Bible. And I go into more detail in other videos. There's also a book about it. But while I was in prison, after reading the Bible, I listened to a radio station that at the time, and still exists, is in Chehalis, Washington. And it was a Seventh-day Adventist radio station. And I learned all these wonderful truths. My favorite program was every Sunday night, Bible Answers Live with this guy named Doug Batchelor. But at the time, I knew nothing at all about Adventism. This was just fascinating Bible truths to me. At the age of 18, I went to the adult prison, and there's a lot of stories that could be told, but suffice it to say that my life changed so much in prison that in 2005, January 11th, I believe, was the last day in office for then Governor Gary Locke, who overturned my sentence and granted me a commutation. Gary Locke would then leave office to become the Secretary of Commerce under Obama, and then the United States Ambassador to China. So I get out of prison in 2005. One of the first things I do is, of course, go find the Adventist church. I get baptized. I start getting involved in volunteer work, feeding the homeless, and then going to Mexico for several weeks to volunteer at an orphanage, and that worked out so well. I got invited to Venezuela for several months to do evangelism and help build some churches with some, at the time, were students from Atlantic Union College. And then I was invited to Costa Rica for 6 months, and then after Costa Rica to Thailand, and then other countries. And so I ended up going to do volunteer work in leper colonies, orphanages, AIDS hospitals, prisons, jails, for many years in East Africa, all throughout Southeast Asia. And then it was how I got into the abortion issue. It was around the year 2012, 2013. I really got interested in the history of the sexual revolution. The way that people talked about sexual issues just didn't make sense to me. I thought, how could such huge changes take place from the 19th century to about the mid 20th century? Something had to happen. And so I just started reading books. It's just a personal curiosity. And as I started to read more and more books, I would occasionally come across references to abortion. And then it was the year 2015. I remember this vividly. It was the summer of 2015. I had just finished reading a book called Marketing Evil, or The Marketing of Evil, by David Kupelian. And there was a chapter in the book about abortion. And I had never really thought about it at all. I mean, it was a brand new topic to me. I'd never really spent time just what is abortion, all that it entails. I'd never watched any abortion videos. And what I read was so shocking. I just couldn't believe that this is what actually happens to a child in the womb. And it just so happened that my wife is an OB-GYN. And I asked my wife, I said, are these things true? Does this really happen? And she said, yeah, that's what happens. And of course, my house is filled with all these OB-GYN books. And so I started pulling them off the shelf and reading. And it was just, and at that moment, when I finished reading the book, right when I finished reading the book, the undercover Planned Parenthood videos came out. You may remember that being in the news, David Deladian over there in California. And so now all of a sudden, just boom, this whole abortion issue comes to my mind and in my awareness. And I realize how terrible and horrific it is. And my first thought was, thank God I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, because we would never do something like this. And I just remember this sense of peace and assurance, like, I'm so glad I'm an Adventist. This is crazy. And then a few weeks, I think it was a few weeks later, maybe a month later, this is around September of 2015. I was curious. I thought, well, I'm just curious, what does my church say about this issue? I really naively thought that we probably didn't have anything on the issue, and that, or if we did, it was clearly that was wrong. And I remember opening up the 1992 guidelines from the official Adventist website and reading through it. And the first thing that went through my mind was, every paragraph is straight out of the sexual revolution. Everything. This has nothing to do with the Bible. All the language, the euphemisms, everything just was smacked to me of, this is the language of the sexual revolutionaries. And then I started reading and studying more, wanting to learn more. And I came across George Gaynor's paper, and I read his research paper that was presented in Loma Linda in 1988 at the conference there. And I was so shocked by this history that I researched and called up George Gaynor, who was then a pastor in Oregon. I said, is this true? These things really happen? And he said, yeah. And that was the end of 2015. During the year 2016, the whole year was very difficult for me, because I realized this is a serious issue. My church is wrong and something needs to be done. But then I was troubled by, what can we do about it? Something needs to be done, but nothing's happening. This needs to change.
Well, just
and I
let me break in for a minute.
Sure, no problem.
Just give me a little preface or a little summary of what is in the GAIN thing, because my understanding of the history is that, basically Roe v. Wade was in January of '73, but for the sexual revolution was really from about 67 to about 73. And part of it was liberalizing liberalizing divorce laws. And part of it was making abortion legal. So in several states, or in a few states, they began to legalize abortion prior to Roe. I mean, the parallels between that, and what happened with the Supreme Court there, and then the same thing with same-sex marriage in the years leading up to 2015 are just the exact same thing. I mean, basically, a liberalization movement started, and then the Supreme Court jumped in on it and said, "Oh no, we're not, or we're going to have one national. We're going to do it nationally." And so the parallels there are freakish. But getting back to, so since 1970, Hawaii has just legalized abortion. So women are flying from the mainland of the United States to Hawaii, and they're getting abortions. And we have an Adventist hospital in Honolulu called Castle Memorial Hospital. And they want in on this bounty of women flying in from California and continental United States to Hawaii to have abortions. So that's kind of where it started. So you take it from there on the Gaynor paper.
So to summarize that situation, when abortion was first legalized, you're correct, before Roe versus Wade, and I believe the first state was Hawaii, and it would have been January 1970 or 71. I think it was 1970. And of course, we have a hospital there, and the hospital has a dilemma. We're an Adventist hospital, abortion is now legalized. We have people coming to our hospital. What are we going to do about this? And so the administrators contacted the NAD or GC church officials and didn't get a really clear decision. And there was a lot of back and forth, which is detailed in Gaynor's paper. But eventually what the church did is they said, okay, we will allow abortions in specific circumstances. And they issued a statement in 1970. Now, when that went to Castle Memorial and I believe other hospitals, the feedback that the church got was, listen, we have non-Adventist doctors or even Adventist doctors, I don't think that specific information is given. They're not happy with the 1970 statement. They want liberalization. They want freedom to perform abortion on demand. And they have said that if you don't offer it in your hospital, we're going to take our patients and go somewhere else, which would have been a big problem for the hospital. And the other problem was that one of the people who showed up that wanted an abortion was a man who had given a huge amount of money to Castle Memorial to help build the hospital. And he showed up and he said, listen, my niece is pregnant. I want you to give her an abortion. I gave you all this money to build this hospital. You need to offer that service to my family member. And so this provided a lot of pressure. So unfortunately, it's a sad documented history that in 1971, the Adventist Church issued another set of guidelines, the 1971 guidelines that were far more liberal, that allowed abortion on demand. And however, church leaders knew, and I hate to say this, but this is just a documented fact, they knew that church members would not accept this. They knew the problems that it would cause, so they kept it a secret. And so for many years, the Adventist Church had ostensibly, or before the public, the 1970 position, which appeared even somewhat conservative, although it still had the health exception, while in practice, they had the 1971 position that allowed abortion for, I forget the exact phrase, like for whatever reasons it had. And then so that would continue until the mid 1980s. And in the mid 1980s, there was, I believe on the East Coast, in an Adventist hospital over there, some Catholics and evangelicals began protesting the practice and support of abortion in front of and at Adventist hospitals. Now, this got published in the Washington Post and international news. And so now this became a big problem for the church. And to summarize the situation, the response of the Adventist Church was in the late 1980s and early 1990s was to begin claiming that abortion was not only or necessarily a medical issue, it was also a religious issue. It's a matter of, quote, conscience or liberty or freedom. It was couched in the terms of the sexual revolution, that women have liberty, they have freedom. You can't tell people what to do. And so that passes that path. We get the new position in 1992, known as the guidelines. So those are in place from 1992 until 2019. Now, going back to what I was doing, in 2017, I decided to start a YouTube channel. I thought this is necessary. Someone needs to explain this history and agitate this issue. Someone has to talk about it, because if we are the remnant church, we can't continue to do this. It's going to cause us a problem. We can't bear false witness on the sixth commandment. So I made all these videos and people told me, you're wrong. The church's stance is biblical. It's never going to change. But suffice it to say that several years later in 2019, to the surprise of a lot of people, our church said we're going to, quote, revisit or modify or change the 1992 position. And we adopted a new position in 2019. And when that was passed in October at the annual council in October of 2019, there were a lot of people who had very warranted and legitimate concerns about Section 6, which states in Section 6, a lot of the statement sounds really nice, but people were concerned about Section 6, which appears to give a loophole for, quote, intentional or deliberate abortions. It says, in rare and extreme cases, human conception may produce pregnancies with, quote, fatal prospects or life-threatening birth anomalies that present individuals with exceptional dilemmas. Decisions in such cases may be left to the conscience of the individuals. So many people, Doug Batchelor and others, raised concerns of, what exactly does this mean? What is a birth anomaly? That's not a medical term. My wife doesn't know what it means. None of her colleagues know what it means. What is a birth anomaly? And we were told by church leaders that what would happen is we would pass the 2019 position, and then the health ministries and the people that worked with them would work on a quote protocol that would further define what this means. Now, this should have been concerning to a lot of people because one individual, he's on video saying this, Dr. Hart at Loma Linda said that we need section 6. We need this sentence to allow for cases like trisomy 21, otherwise known as Down syndrome. He didn't say Down syndrome, he said trisomy 21. He used the technical term, which would have been very disturbing because we had people even in the audience like Larry Evans, who says that children with Down syndrome are children made in the image of God, and we need to take care of them and protect them, and so on. Well, to the surprise of a lot of people, or maybe to the surprise of very few, in 2020, the health ministries finally published their protocol without any announcement. This was about July or August of 2020. And in the protocol, it defined birth anomalies to include intentional abortion for, quote, a mother's mental health, which is the exact same language used in previous statements and in Roe versus Wade to allow for abortion on demand. So this created a big problem. A lot of people were upset. And within like a few weeks, the General Conference had deleted that protocol and replaced it with another one, which is really interesting because all they do is copy and paste the same phrase. For example, the 2019 position says that the Adventist Church only allows abortion for, quote, birth anomaly. Well, what does a birth anomaly mean? Well, if you look at the actual protocol, it just copies and pastes the exact same sentence. So it just says birth anomaly. So we don't really have a definition. It's like saying, if you made up a word like Kawabajok, and you asked somebody, what is a Kawabajok? And they said a Kawabajok is a Kawabajok. That's what the church has done. They said a birth anomaly is a birth anomaly. But that doesn't answer the question. That doesn't help. So as of right now, in what is this now? In July of 2022, our church is, in my opinion, not clear at all on this position.
In other words, they've produced a good sounding statement, but there's a huge exception that you could drive a truck through, that according to...
Yeah, there's no definition.
Right, according to Richard Hart at Loma Linda, that at least allows for aborting Down syndrome children. So, that's according to Hart. Now, other people are going to say, well, there's other birth defects or whatever. But in other words, there's an exception that is in danger of swallowing the rule that at least includes Down syndrome, right?
Correct. And on an issue like this, there should not be that vague or nebulous language. There should be no room for people to misunderstand it. We know we're clear on the Sabbath, we're clear on smoking, we're clear on alcohol, we're clear on all these other issues. Why are we so unclear on whether it's okay to kill a child in certain circumstances?
Of course, the answer to that is we want a strong statement that is opposed to abortion for purposes of public relations, but we don't want to change whatever we're doing clinically in our hospitals. That's
correct.
Yeah. But going back to, let's go back to where you talked about the Adventist Church essentially came up with a theory of how abortion is a religious liberty issue, and the theory, as I understand it, from its modern expositors, which the most famous of which is Kevin Paulson, but it has others, is that, and I think this originated, you may know more about this than I do, there was a Serbian immigrant whose original name I don't know, but he changed his name to John Stevens. And John Stevens was very influential in promoting the view that an unborn child was not really a living soul, and that a living soul was only a baby that had taken a breath outside the womb, and then it was a real person. That became one of the Adventist beliefs that Stevens promoted. But broadening out from abortion to other issues, sort of Kevin Paulson theory is that any law, criminal law or civil prohibition on behavior that is motivated by a Christian impetus or a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview is an improper imposing of your religious beliefs on the population at large. And that's not a workable theory, because Christian motivation is behind all kinds of reforms in society: prison reforms, insane asylum reforms, outlawing slavery. I mean, Ellen White's, one of her big issues was prohibition of alcohol. And so if you say, oh, anything that has a Christian motivation is improper, then basically you would have to disagree with Ellen White, because she wanted Adventists to go out and vote for prohibition. And it was, the reason why was this was part of the Christian worldview of alcohol, ruins families, it ruins marriages, it causes violence, it causes domestic abuse and all these things. And so, I mean, basically, I think there's a basic misunderstanding of what is proper legislation. And actually, this came up in something that happened the day that Roe was decided, and they had a big Zoom call with about 6 different people that were involved in Adventist public affairs and religious liberty. And one of the current general counsels that works in the general counsel's office, I've forgotten his name, but you'll remember it.
Todd McFarlane.
Yeah, Todd McFarlane. He forgot about the case of Webster versus Reproductive Health Services. And in that case, the Adventist Church actually took what I call the Kevin Paulson position, which is anything that is motivated by a biblical worldview is it violates the establishment of religion clause, or is legitimate, it restricts liberty. So that was interesting.
Yeah, so for any of the viewers who don't know, in the 1980s, 1988, Missouri passed a law opposing abortion to some degree, and I think it was in the preamble to the law or some note within the law that said, affirm that life begins at conception. And the Adventist legal counsel at the time, one of them, his name was Robert Nixon, and he's listed there in the Adventist yearbook, 1989, the year that the amicus was filed. He filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, together with another well-known Adventist attorney, Lee Boothby, and also with a group called Americans United Against Church and State. So they all combined together and filed this amicus brief, making the claim that Missouri had violated the Establishment of Religion Clause by passing a law which was by their definitions, but by the Adventist claim, theological in nature, or theological. It was a theological claim, and that cannot be substantiated in any way by science, which is ridiculous, because that was the year 1988, 1989, and 10 years previous, in 1978, we had the world famous test tube children. I mean, clearly establishing, the knowledge that life begins at conception. I think the earliest discovery on record, which was the father of embryology, I forget his name, it's German, was way back in 1826. The knowledge that life begins at conception, that was a science that had especially developed and advanced during the mid 19th century. So here we are over 100 years later, And we are claiming in an amicus brief before the Supreme Court that even science can't tell when a new human life begins. And so we have the Adventists, them arguing before making this claim, absurd, indefensible claim before the Supreme Court. And that's on public record. And just a few days ago, when Roe versus Wade is overturned, the legal counsel Todd McFarlane said that we had never filed an amicus brief, which was not true. And to his credit, to be fair, he said that he did not know anything about that, which I find hard to believe. But to be fair, he said he was ignorant of that amicus. So that's a troubling part in our history that needs to be addressed, I think.
Well, it's probably to Todd's credit that he doesn't remember these things, but I mean, the Adventist Church has been completely out to sea on this, and we've adopted it completely wrong. It's a wrong philosophy of church and state, of what is permissible legislation and what's not, and it's not workable for many different reasons. And we've written about this on our website, Fulcrum 7, quite a bit, but it's just not the idea that Christians cannot be in favor of any laws because they favor those laws because of their Christian worldview. It's just not workable. I mean, Christianity has made the modern world in the West, within Christendom, we've made it with Christian attitudes. And that includes, some liberal things, because, inclusion and love and acceptance is a Christian value, as well as having Christian standards of behavior in terms of don't do wrong and immoral acts. So it's just it's completely ridiculous thing, and it's time that we came out of it. And unfortunately, it's just, I don't know, it's bad stuff. But and by the way, it's not just the history of the bad public affairs, religious liberty philosophy. There's some real bad actions. I mean, I wrote a column several years ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago, about a guy named Edward Allred, who was a pioneer in, basically abortion quickly went from something done in a hospital to something done in an outpatient clinic that is essentially an abortion mill. And Edward Allred pioneered the abortion mill. Made a bunch of money on that, gave some of it to the church, given some of it to La Sierra, given some of it to Loma Linda. He's a La Sierra and a Loma Linda grad. And he, it's some dark history. I mean, he got rich off of, never spending more than 5 to 8 minutes with each woman.
Yeah, that's right. Something I thought it was remarkable, because I've posted a blog, and I'll send you the link, of all the known articles that have been published about Allred. And I came across this fascinating article. I don't remember which one it was. Maybe it was the article from the Fresno Bee in the 1980s or something. But Allred makes this interesting claim that he says the idea that a new human life begins at conception, that's a religious view. That's something. And I thought that was remarkable, because he's paraphrasing, or almost citing verbatim from what the Adventist Church has taught in our official books. For example, in all of our books, What Adventists Believe, published by the GC, all versions, 1985, 2003, and then 2018, like all of them, on the chapter, The Nature of Man, says, under the definition of soul, a new soul comes into existence whenever a child is born. And that's also repeated in our official Adventist encyclopedia. And to my knowledge, the earliest, if you search that phrase in Adventist literature, the earliest occurrence of that goes back to Questions on Doctrine in 1957. I don't know the whole history of that book or that situation. I know there's a whole discussion you can have about that. But Adventism, to my knowledge, has never really addressed or grappled with the nature of the unborn child. And what we have published is grossly misleading, or just not true, because the Bible affirms multiple times in both the Hebrew and the Greek, Old and New Testaments, that the unborn are defined with the exact same living words, Greek and Hebrew words used for born children. And we've never grappled with that. And I personally don't see how we are ever going to get out of this problem unless we go back and address what is the unborn child. Is it just a clump of cells? Is it some ethereal, mystical, magical, spiritual inhabitation of some, living mass in the uterus, or is it a child? Is it a baby? This has to be addressed, because once you define the unborn as a living human child, then all the theology will naturally follow. That's what I think anyway. And for Edward Allred to recite that, I thought was somewhat illuminating and ironic in a sick way, because he would go on to become the most notorious abortionist, who boasted in his 1983 interview, by that time, of having performed over 250,000 abortions. And he continued at that same rate until he retired. I think he retired in 88 or 89. So by the time he would have retired, he would have performed well over 300,000 abortions. And to our great embarrassment, he is very much affiliated with the Adventist Church. And the Adventist Church many Adventist churches or institutions have no problem accepting money from him, which is also a problem, because he's one of the most famous horse gamblers in the entire world. He has a horse racing track, and our official Adventist position says our church will not accept money from anyone involving gambling in any way, shape, form, or whatever. That's at the bottom line of the gambling statement. So we have a really big problem, and it's going to need to be addressed, because prophetically, at some point between now and in the future, prophetically, at some point, the church is going to have to take a biblical position. And I don't know that that's going to be a pleasant process if we consider some of the resistance and attitudes that we've seen over the past 30 plus years.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, because it's the science is clear. When an egg is fertilized, you have DNA from the mother and the father, and you have a new person who has unique DNA, and that will always be the person's DNA until they're born, until they grow up, until they die. That's the science.